We're having our historical meeting at the firehouse, and Bayonne Ward Gowan is going to be giving a talk on the Candor mills. And we have some artifacts here, which I will record later to some degree.
Much for coming. It's great to see such a turnout tonight for this great historic talk. I know that there's a lot of interest because a lot of us remember the mills, and we're glad you're here. I have a few brief things that I'm going to go over quickly before we introduce our speaker for this evening. I'm Milt Doherty. I'm president of the Historical Society this year. Just to let you know who else is involved in the Historical Society. Our vice president is my wife Pat over there. Georgia Westgate is the secretary. Where are you, Georgia? Georgia's in the back. And Dan Weber is our treasurer. Our directors at large, Barbara Evans. Where are you, Barbara? She's there. Mary Louise Collins over there, and Howard Weber. Of course, everybody knows Howard. Just a little information about the Society and what we have coming up so that you're invited to participate in any of these. August 11th, we're going to have our first annual Historical Society picnic. It's going to be held at Homestar, August 11th. And there is a sign-up sheet that is going to be going around. You're all invited to come if you'd like to participate. It's a dish to pass, bring your own serving utensils. We'll provide the beverage, a lawn chair to sit in. It's going to be held whether it's raining or sun shining because we have an indoor place we can go to. So that's the 11th of August. In September, we'll have our regular Historical Society meeting at the Senior Citizens Home. Then in October, on the 24th, Howard Weber is going to be doing the fourth in our series this year of historic talks, and he's going to be talking, I think, on early tools, right? And he has a great collection, so I know that'll be really interesting. We're also going to participate in the Candor Old Home Day on August 25th at Moyer Park. We're going to be just have a presence there. We're going to have our items on display to sell and just to make sure that we're out there in front of people, make ourselves known. So we'll be there at the Candor Old Home Day. Then on October 6th, we'll be involved with the Fall Fest. We'll have our regular bake sale and rummage sale, and we'll be located at the Masonic Hall from 10 until 4 that day. If any of you have items that you'd like to contribute to our rummage sale, we'd be very happy to take them. We're trying to avoid clothing. If you have some other items that you think somebody might be interested in that you're no longer interested in, we'd be happy to have them. And if you'd like to contribute to our bake sale, something that we can sell at a bake sale, we'd be very happy to have that too. So if you're interested in any of those and can help us out, Yeah. Um, Please see one of us, and so we know that to expect something to come in. One of the other things that we have started is what we call a resident history project. And basically we're seeking some family information. And there'll be some sheets being passed around. If you can help us out, it's just it's kind of self-explanatory on the sheet. But what we're trying to do is gather a database of residents of Candor, some of their family history, background, maiden names, children, so we become a source of information. That may cause us a problem later. A source of information for anyone doing some family research or just some school projects people want to know. So if you can help us out, please take a sheet as it comes around. If you will, you can fill it in. We'll turn that off for right now. We have an interference somewhere, and I'm not sure where. So take one. If you would like to contribute that information to us, either give it to one of us or send it into our post office box. If you did not receive our second newsletter, there are some extra copies over on that table over there. So please pick one up. And if we run out, we'll make some more. Just let us know that you want one and you didn't get one. And there are also some membership forms over there on the table. If you're not a member and you'd like to be, we certainly can use your support. Please pick up a membership form and fill it out. Also over on the table we have all of our fundraising items, our Afghan, the magnets, the notepads, the cracks. Please look them over. If you would like one of them, my wife will be there. She'd be happy to accommodate you. One other thing, Carol has her books here. If you have not gotten your book about the village history, Carol's here with her books. Please see her about that. If you're interested in an art tour in Europe, the Tioga County Historical Society and the Tioga County Council of the Arts is sponsoring a tour to Europe, very good price. I'll put these over on the table. If you're interested, pick one up. And also, some of you may receive in the mail a form, a survey form. There's a man by the name of Tim Schwartz who is doing a research project. Let me just very briefly read you the news release that he has sent. Whether it goes in the paper exactly this way or not, I'm not sure, but let me read you this. So if you get the survey form, you know what it's about, and you know that he's on the up and up, and if you can help him out, do so. His name is Dr. T.P. Schwartz. He's a sociologist. He's taught at Brown University, University of North Carolina, Delaware, Connecticut. He's the Director of Social Research Services in Rhode Island. And he'd like to include a chapter in a book that he's writing on Candor, about contemporary social life in famous small towns in the U.S. and abroad. Excuse me. He's chosen, obviously, Candor, because Candor became quite famous as a subject of a previous book, and he's hoping to. He's what? No, no, he isn't. But his take is completely different from the previous book. He hopes that current residents of Candor will be willing to meet with him during the next few months and also provide candid answers to his questions so that he can write a fair and honest description of community life in American small towns such as Candor. The other release is this. I'm writing a book on contemporary social life in small towns and villages in America and abroad. I would like to include at least one chapter on Candor based on current information provided by a fair sample of residents in your town. Please help me during the next few months by simply conversing with me if you meet me in Candor and by filling out a short survey that you might receive through the mail A postage-paid envelope will enable you to mail back the form, and thanks for participating. His take is completely different. He's really looking for the interaction between family and friends within the community. So if you get a form, you know what it's about. Okay, that's everything that I have in the way of introduction. We're very happy to have with us Bayonne Gowan. Bayonne has an intimate knowledge of the mills of Candor, and we're happy to have her tonight. Okay, Don, we'll see whether we have a problem.
I'm on, am I?
Okay, you're on.
Okay. We all worked there one time or another, except my little sister Marcia. I don't know why she missed out, but I started work there when I was between high school and college in the summer. And it was such a hot day this one day, like yesterday, and as a lowly employee, I had to go to the grocery store and get some pop. It had to be cold, and it had to be the best variety. So I got the 6-pack of pop to bring back for the men's break. And I set it down next to some empty bottles, or bottles that were being used for oil. And on a day like yesterday, it was very dangerous because the gluten or oats would set up, and the miller had to go into the bin and take the temperature, and it had to be moved. Well, Pete Van Scoy had just been moving some gluten, and that is hot, sticky, rotten stuff. He came out to the mill where the men were having their break, and he upped a bottle of Coke. Immediately out came a huge spew of oil, plus his false teeth, plus purple words. And of course, I got blamed as because I set it down next to their refreshments. So that was my introduction. I was all downhill from there. So there. Now, I was looking back over this paper, I did it in 1967 in July for a graduate course of the 500 level of New York State history. And I'm very grateful that I was forced to do this because my father died 2 months later, the end of September, and he helped me with this. So if you have any questions, he has read this, he approved of it, and I may interpret it a little bit differently than you do. Howard Weber and Bob Weber have been in on the planning, and their father was very important to the mills, and so I'll touch on that later. The wide Catatunk Creek had a good flow of water the year round, which made it a ready means of power and transportation. The heavily wooded forests forced the early settlers to choose lumbering as their primary livelihood. The settlers built a dam 250 feet long, about a half a mile above the old Indian fort, which is now the cemetery. Soon sawmills clustered around this dam. In 1795, Samuel Hart built the first small gristmill and distillery. Early in the 19th century, the lumbering business was thriving, making another dam feasible. This dam was 300 feet long and situated about a quarter of a mile below the old fort. A sawmill was built on the east side of the lower dam. On the west side, Hart built a weaving mill where women could weave their own woolen cloth. Now, the 1825 census, New York State Census, saw 12 sawmills in the town of Candor. Now, it's quite a few sawmills, but the town of Candor takes in Wiltshieville, Catatunk, Hubbardtown. I know there were several up on the Straits Corners Road where the Polish Sea is now. The sawmill by the lower dam burned in 1832. The gradual depletion of the forest and the subsequent rise of farms created enough demand to support a second grist mill built on the site of the sawmill. Caleb Sackett and Elijah Smith were partners in this new grist mill. The 1835 census lists the Sackett and Smith venture as having purchased grain valued at $2,000 and produced manufactured goods valued at $3,000. This is quite a bit when you consider 1835. This is tremendous work. At this time, there were 30 sawmills in the town of Candor, with raw material valued at nearly $17,000 and the value of manufactured lumber at $42,000. We were a thriving community. The Hart grist mill was not so prosperous. It was using $300 worth of grain, and there was no value listed on their manufactured goods. Lumbering was still a dominant factor in the economy of Candor. This new grist mill that Sackett and Smith built was 3 stories high with a complicated array of bins, shafts, spouts, and housing for the 4 run of stone. Now, a run of stone were 2 huge burr stones. The one I'm thinking of, the bottom stone was 3/4 of a ton, and the top stone was a ton. And all of this equipment had to be built of wood, requiring designing and engineering skills besides the skill of carpenter. These 3 attributes were combined in the craft of a millwright, Joel Robinson, who built the mill. And I looked up in one book, and he died at 94. He was a remarkable man. His skill is witnessed by the durability of the mill, which was in continuous use for 116 years. On an old wooden slide, which I could not find, used to stop the flow of grain from a bin, is written the contents of the various bins where the different shafts would send the grain. And this mill writing, you had to realize where all of these things go in the bins and which finished grain and undone grain had to be. Spout 5 took select corn over stone, or in other words, to be ground as cornmeal. Spout 6 took select corn to the whiskey room. They made whiskey there. The slide also lists various grades of wheat and buckwheat that either were ground for flour or for animal feed, depending on the quality of the original grain. The miller extracted a portion of this grinding for grinding the grist. The miller's portion was distilled into whiskey, or the best grain was used for whiskey, or ground into table flour. And they sold whiskey out of the Sackett and Smith mill. The miller was usually relatively prosperous within the community. Sackett built the house with the pillars that you know as the Wells House and lived there. It was close to his mill. An entry in the Smith and Sackett 1840 account book tells of renting for $1.25 a horse and buggy to a villager to drive to Ithaca. The same 1840 entry book shows a receipt of $1 for a quart of whiskey. The sale and consumption of whiskey was not frowned upon during this era, so that Smith was able to serve as a Presbyterian deacon with a clear conscience. The Sackett and Smith mill jutted out over the water because the mill had to be over the turbine wheel. Your romantic notion of the wheel on the side just is not so. The turbine wheel required a mill race through which the water was forced by pressure built up behind the dam. This rush of water turned the turbine, thus propelling the drive shaft, which turned the millstones and ran belts to the grain elevators. The better known and preferred overshot wheel, which sat vertically along the side of a mill, necessitated a waterfall of up to 20 feet. but did not need as much water volume or pressure as did the turbine wheel. And these New England mills and West Virginia mills are the ones that you could use the water wheel, overshot wheel. Lacking a waterfall, the Candor miller had to use a dam and a turbine. The sensitive turbine wheel did not work well during a flood because its smooth functioning was dependent on the water rushing away. A flood would prevent the water from moving away fast enough, and they couldn't, it minimized the horsepower. Ideally, the wheel would turn out the equivalent of 40 horsepower, which the Sackett and Smith mill did, but the average output, according to my father, was 25 horsepower. The water for the turbine wheel was fed through a narrow concrete mill race controlled by a butterfly gate. This mill race had an opening at the mill end about 3 feet square. When the butterfly gate was closed and the water gate to the mill pond opened, the mill race would fill and build up pressure. The butterfly gate would be opened and the rush of water would turn the turbine. The butterfly gate was covered by wooden grating to keep waterborne debris from fouling the turbine. And I can remember my father with a great wide wooden rake cleaning off the grates. I can also remember being able to swim in this mill race, which was a great treat. I see some of you probably also did. The mill pond was formed by the 300-foot-long dam, which was only 6 feet high. The pressure for the mill was dependent upon the store of water in the pond. The grist milling business was thriving in 1838, so that Jesse and Ogden Smith built a grist mill on the east side of the upper dam, replacing the Hart mill. This mill was made of brick and had 4 runs of stone. I have a picture of this, the brick mill, known as the upper mill. That's the upper mill. They also had 4 runs of stone. The Sackett and Smith mill also had 4 runs of stone, giving Candor a total of 8. This is minor compared with Rochester, the leading milling city, which had 21 mills boasting 96 runs of stone by 1835. A run of stone was a pair of grinding stones made of imported French burr stone, about 4 feet in diameter. The top stone is stationary and the bottom stone turns. And the bottom stone has grooves chipped in it and whirled around on a lignum vitae, which is a very hard wood bearing. The grain was fed into the center where it distributed itself into the grooves of the burr stone. The top stone could be raised or lowered to control the extent or coarseness of the grist. The raising of the top stone, weighing 1 ton, was accomplished by turning a wooden wheel the size of an automobile wheel on the main floor, which turned the controlling wooden screw. And I think this is, my knowledge, what opened let it loose, the wheel, but I'm not sure. Maybe Howard Weber has never idea. You're going to say, well, that's rumored. Certainly a big screwdriver, that's for sure. After the grain was ground between the 2 stones, the ground grain then flowed to the outside of the stones into the wooden housing, and thence was drawn into a shaft to be elevated from the basement to the proper bin. A slow, steady flow of grain was essential for proper operation of the stones, with even grinding of the grist. The waste material, which remained toward the center of the stones, was allowed to run into the creek. The grooves on the bottom 3/4 ton wheel had to be re-chipped whenever the amount of use made the stone too smooth to grind an even textured product. The chipping was done with an iron chisel, being a tedious, muscle-fatiguing task, according to my father. The upper wheel had to be raised as soon as the grain flow ceased to prevent the stones from grinding each other. And I have a memory of people rushing around and grinding the grain and going up in the elevators, and if the elevators stuck, my father would come along and kick the shaft. You did too, probably, Howard. Spaulding and Company leased the lower mill from the Sackett estate and ran it from 1863 to 1873. The 1865 New York census lists the Sackett mill valued at $10,000 by this time, containing $2,500 worth of machinery and employing 2 men. Young and Hoff bought the mill from the Sackett estate in 1873. The Upper Smith Mill was sold to Huxon and Hawley, and they then leased it to a devious person named Beebe. Beebe was kind of mean. He would run his grist mill at night, allowing the water to flow downstream and over dam, releasing the pressure at a time when others could not use it. Had Beebe been neighborly, he could have aided Young and Hoff. And you have to remember 1873 was the time of a Great Depression, almost as great as the 30s. And doing business was difficult at best. He could have run his mill at the same time as Young and Hoff, thus giving them a rush of pressure. Due to Beebe's policy, the lower mill was able to only run 3 hours a day. Young and Hoff were compelled to install steam auxiliary power. A wood-burning steam engine could not have been situated in the mill since it constituted a grave fire hazard, and Bob Weber brought the fire bucket there. A leather pulley from the steam engine to the drive shaft turned the stones and the elevators. A mill with its open shaft work and flour dust and grain dust and grain heating up was always prone to have a fire and a great worry to everybody. Sometimes millers were noted for chewing tobacco rather than smoking. We had one man who worked for us whose tobacco juice dripped out of both sides of his mouth. He claimed he was level-headed that way. Young left the partnership to go west about 1890. Hoff was harassed by a price war between himself and the new owners of the upper mill, Johnson and Bostwick. The Depression of 1893 was a particularly difficult time for New York farmers who suffered from competition from the newly settled western states who could produce grain and hogs and whatnot more cheaply than we could. Hoff, ailing and discouraged, sold his grist mill to Ellis and Moore in 1893, which was a very fine move. They were very aggressive, forward-looking men. Ellis and Moore also purchased the upper mill from Johnson and Bostwick in 1893, ending the price war and enabled them to control the flow of water. This consolidation of the two businesses made it feasible to confine the buckwheat flour production to the lower mill. During the buckwheat harvest season, the lower mill was operated night and day, milling fine buckwheat flour. They installed a new roller mill, primarily for grinding the buckwheat flour, and the upper mill was used primarily for grinding grist and chop feed or horse feed. I have the plans for their 1893 roller mill. The rolls were not the burstone, they were of metal. And if you want to look at the plans later, you may. I don't read. Ellis and Moore were successful businessmen who were able to rescue the mills from the adverse effects of the 1893 Depression. Buckwheat flour, probably some of you know what buckwheat flour was used for. A lot of you do. Was very popular as a base for hearty pancakes. Hardworking farmers, lumbermen, and Pennsylvania coal miners considered buckwheat pancakes indispensable for starting the working day. Even though at this time, 1898, Aunt Jemima ready-mixed pancake flour was marketed by the Pillsbury Company. But the housewives were very resistant. I mean, city folk could have Aunt Jemima, but good hometown folk had to have buckwheat pancakes. The Aunt Jemima was one of the earliest convenience food. When the new crop buckwheat flour was available, the housewife made a new batter with fresh yeast, molasses, bacon fat, buckwheat flour, and sour milk in a large batter pitcher. I had one at home, but I didn't bring it. Every day, she saved a little of the bubbly batter to start the next day's batter, adding buckwheat flour, etc., as needed. By the end of the winter, the batter was very sour, nearly inedible, and unless one were engaged in active outdoor work, distressing to the digestive system. My mother taught school up on Anderson Hill and had to board around. That's the way you did. And the farmer that she boarded with, the buckwheat mix was dreadful, and she just couldn't eat it. So when they were away one day, she poured it out. And that was something one does not do. Ellis and Moore were able to sell their fine buckwheat flour throughout southern New York and northern Pennsylvania under the brand name of York State Flour. They're the ones that came up with the York State name. Ellis and Moore replaced the wood-burning steam engine with a gas engine for more consistent power, economically retaining the water turbine for use when the pressure was high, and they used the water right up until the very end when they moved out of the mill. The stones were no longer used to grind flour because they turned too slowly and ground too coarsely. The stones were good enough to grind grist for animal feed. They installed the roller mill, which I showed you plans for, 1893, to grind the buckwheat flour. The buckwheat, it's very seldom grown anymore. It's got a very hard hull, it's black, and it also kind of drains the land, and it's harvested at the very end of September and the first part of October, so that you couldn't put a cover crop of clover or timothy with it, and it did erode the land considerably, and so it's probably, well, it was not used anymore. The buckwheat was elevated to the scourer on the top floor. The scourer contained two wire screens, one coarse and one fine, which removed the dust and dirt. The grain flowed by gravity to a bin, thence to the roller mill, blueprint. The grain was fed slowly into the 20-inch crushing rolls. These rolls were made of corrugated steel. One roll moved clockwise, the other roll moved somewhat slower in a counterclockwise direction. These rolls crushed the hard grain. The flow of grain had to be constant, and the minute the grain flow ceased, the rolls had to be thrown apart or the rolls would ruin themselves. The crushed grain was elevated upstairs to the sifter. The first sifter was made of silk, coarse enough to allow everything but the hulls to pass through. And I have a sample of this, of the silk that was what they sifted the flour through. The sifters worked like this, and there were silk things, and I brought a book that, as of 1890, you could order a boat of the sifting silk if it so happened to desire. The lighter black hulls, or offal, that's spelled O-F-F-A-L, not awful, was spouted to a bagger to be given away as bedding for chickens, burned, or dumped into the creek. Local rumor had it that the sharp Ellis and Moore installed an attrition mill to grind the buckwheat hulls to be sold to a spice company for adulterating black pepper. It was done in those days. Another use of buckwheat hulls were for insulating new buildings. The hulls were poured into the outer walls between the siding and whatever formed the inside walls. At that time, there were buildings still standing in Candor in which this material was used as insulation. I don't know how you would prove it. The material that would go through the fine silk was flour that was spouted to the first floor flour bin to be bagged. And there were 25-pound bags with these are. The coarse grain was elevated to the top floor and sent through a smaller set of 15-inch rolls and again through the sifter. This was repeated 4 times until all the grain was ground and sifted. The grain that remained after the 4th rolling and sifting was drawn off to be mixed with the cow feed. The buckwheat flour averaged 29 pounds from 50 pounds of whole grain. The best yields were milled on cold, dry days. There would be 10 pounds from every 50 that went into cow feed. The rest was offal. When grinding for shipment to Europe, the 4th sifting would be eliminated, giving 32 pounds of flour, as European liked a somewhat coarser flour. Ellis and Moore did not sell to the export market, but Wardenskoy did. They sold quite a bit to a group in Holland. The year 1900 was notable for a disastrous flood, which destroyed the sawmill opposite the upper grist mill, and these same rampaging waters ripped out the aging lower dam. Ellis and Moore built a new dam which spanned the creek in a diagonal direction and was only 200 feet long. The weaving mill, which had shared the dam, had grown to a modest-sized blanket factory since the Civil War, now converted to steam power to run their machinery. When Ellis died in 1916, Moore sold a thriving business to M.C. Meservey, who maintained the mills through World War I. He speculated on the grain market, making a substantial fortune for a small-town businessman. Meservey sold the business in 1920 to Holmes and Haight. This partnership was fraught with personal incompatibility, so Holmes sold his share on June 25, 1925 to C. Paul Ward. Holmes and Haight's wives were sisters, so they were brothers-in-law, so you can imagine what the... Holmes went off to Owego to start his own mill. C.P., who had been previously associated with the cattle and horse trading firm of O.J. Ward and Sons, was a novice in the milling business. Misfortune struck the new partnership in 1928 when Haight died of a heart attack up on Cass Hill, leaving Ward to run the business in partnership with widow Haight. And clear up until the middle 30s, we went to Aunt Jenny and made a payment, and Aunt Jenny was still pretty much involved in it. She was a lovely lady, I remember. Maybe some of you remember Aunt Jenny. She lived in a house that's now a vacant lot across from 96 Connection. Was her house. The period from 1926 to 1929 was a peak of their buckwheat flour production. The highest production occurred in 1928 when 228 tons of fine buckwheat flour were manufactured. The prices received for flour were the highest at this time, averaging around $4.25 per 100 pounds wholesale. Haight and Ward shipped York State brand buckwheat flour by railroad as far away as the Albany and Philadelphia areas, also to Holland. The A&P Company, Freyhofer's Baking Company of Philadelphia, Gimbel Brothers of Philadelphia, and Jameson Boyce of Binghamton were their major customers. The firm of Haight and Ward also made horse, cattle, and poultry feeds under the York State brand. These feeds were now licensed by the Department of Agricultural and Markets, and I have the application for the licenses, and if the inspector came around and you didn't have an ingredient in there that you had licensed, you had to change it. And during the war, that was one of my jobs, is to write laboriously the changes of the ingredients that they had to put in. Feed samples were sent to Cornell University, where Professor George Kavanaugh of the Department of Agricultural Chemistry analyzed the feed for percentages of protein, fat, fiber, carbohydrates, and moisture, thus making a balanced feed. And this marked the beginning of increasing government control and taxation. In April of 1929, R.D. Van Scoy bought Mrs. Haight's portion of the business. The partnership of Ward and Van Scoy employed 7 men in the 2 mills in 1929, and the retail business had been expanded to sell fertilizer, seeds, lumber, cement, and farmers were becoming aware of the necessity for certified seeds. No longer did they just save their own crop to replant the next spring. They bought certified seed, which would produce a great deal more and less weeds. Through the educational efforts of Cornell University, farmers were beginning to be modernized. They had a retail outlet in Wilseyville, and Ed Hoos managed it. Do you remember Ed Hoos? I remember him. You remember him, Margaret? The upper mill was used exclusively. Pardon? Well, yeah. The upper mill was used exclusively for manufacturing animal feeds, so Ward and Van Scoy installed a molasses blender and molasses storage tank in the upper mill. Do any of you remember that old molasses tank truck? Describe it, Howard.
We had it mounted on an old Shady Drive International, the high rubber tires. And my dad used to get the oil in sometimes, and he'd come home with clothes plastered from one end to the other with molasses. He hated the job, I know, I remember that.
You had to build a fire under it in January, I tell you.
Yeah.
Molasses added an agreeable taste to the feed, flavor and texture. Molasses had the dual capacity for being cheap as well as nutritious, and this was an essential factor after the disastrous 1929 crash. The early 1930s was a difficult period for Candor area farmers. The price for buckwheat flour dropped from $4 for 100 pounds in October of 1929 to $1.90 in 1934. The farmers had used buckwheat to pay for their animal feeds, and now the price of buckwheat had dropped so low, farmers became indebted to the miller for cow feed. It was a cash crop. It wasn't used primarily for animal feed. Oh, here's a guy. They had to lay down the law. This is doubly important because on the back is obviously plans for the new mill. And I found it all shredded up in the bottom of the trunk in my collection. Howard probably can read that. The New York State compounded the difficulty by adding a sales tax at this time. Plus, the United States Treasury placed a tax of 30 cents a bushel on all wheat ground for grist or commercial feed, which, to me, this is incomprehensible for farmers in a very poor condition to have this extra thing. Come on. Ward and Van Scoy continued to sell York State flour to their former customers despite keen competition. Wittenberg, an exporter, bought York State buckwheat flour for shipment to Holland. The Candor Company also bought newly harvested buckwheat and resold it to the Quaker Oats Company of Akron, Ohio, in an effort to avert a financial disaster. And I have the Quaker Oats Company, June 3rd, 1933. We were in the market for a couple of cars of good dark Japanese buckwheat. Not over 18% moisture, contain not more than 6% dockage, and dockage allowance to us in excess of 2% for shipment to our mill at Akron, Ohio. We will buy this on the basis of Akron approval as to quality and Akron weights finest. Whether or not you have any buckwheat to answer this description, will you kindly answer the enclosed postal card and mail it to us? Okay. There are other letters here. This is from the Wittenberg, the Holland, and it's in very strange English. This is October 30th, 1929, their order for flour. And the Truman Company of Illegal, Truman grocery store, got 300 pounds of flour in 10-pound sacks for $12. That's in October of 1929. That's the Truman people. I see you over there. And they bought hay. They had a hay barn where the big mill is now. And they had the farmers bring in their loose hay, and Harley Ferguson with his stationary baler baled it up in wire bales, and they shipped it to New York City, because the New York City Police Department was horse-mounted, and they had to have hay. And so that was a pretty good market. The miller had to cope with natural disasters such as fire, flood, and uncertain weather conditions. Smoking was prohibited because of the flammable nature of feed and flour dust. The weather conditions at the time of this grain harvest could be a problem. A very wet year would cause the grain to have a high moisture content. This high moisture grain would be difficult to grind and had a tendency to spoil quickly. If stored for any length of time in a bin, high moisture grain is apt to generate heat, creating the risk of spontaneous combustion. The miller had to climb into a bin to check the temperature of the grain, and if a bin full of grain was too hot, it had to be drawn off into bags to cool. The miller was required to maintain a constant vigilance against foreign objects such as hammers, nails, etc., which might have slipped into the grain. The modern mill has a magnet to catch some of these human errors. Another ever-present danger, which could mean disaster, was that of a flood. In the spring of 1935, there was a severe flood, and I have a vivid memory of this. Catwalks over the water 3 feet above the turbine wheel enabled the miller to oversee and repair the wheel and elevators. The water rose rapidly to within 2 feet of the main floor of the upper mill, completely covering all of the machinery. Edgar Vinskoy, son of R.D. Vinskoy, who had bought his father's interest in 1934, lowered himself to the catwalks to investigate the conditions of the machinery. And I can remember being gripped by my father as I looked over at Pete Vinskoy walking around there, and Pete could not swim, and he was afraid of water, which, but I was terrified, and I can just see that black water swirling around, and I could sense my father's worry. There was a danger that the 16-foot square, heavy timbered wheelhouse containing the drive wheel and gears would be torn away by the flood. There were 3 days when the mills were inoperable, although there wasn't any permanent damage to either mill or the dams. The impending World War II began to remove the financial strain from the farmers and related businesses. The farmers of the area gradually changed from cash crops and small dairies to ever larger dairies, larger and larger. The dairy farmers grew legumes for hay and corn for ensilage and bought commercial animal feeds instead of relying exclusively on their own grain for grist. Many carloads of Western grain were shipped by rail to Wardenvinskoye for use in the manufacture of their great varieties of licensed feed. They bought corn, oats, linseed oil meal, cottonseed oil meal, gluten, distillers' grains, brewers' grains, beet pulp, citrus pulp, and molasses. These came by railroad, which created a logistics problem. Neither mill was situated near the railroad, so that all of the grain had to be unloaded and trucked to the mills. The grain usually was shipped in bulk of 30 to 40-ton lots, and this loose grain problem. There was a great deal of time and effort wasted in handling this loose grain. The company owned the hay barn, located on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroads, situated in the center of the village. Plans were made for a modern 5-story electric-powered mill to be built around the hay barn. They decided to abandon the now minor buckwheat flour business and concentrate exclusively on manufacturing animal feeds. The sedentary population no longer required buckwheat pancakes to start the day. Wardenvinskoye Incorporated in 1948 with C.P. Ward, Edgar L. Vinskoye, and C. Keene Ward as members of the corporation. They contracted to have the mill built by Isaac Decker with the mill writing to be done by Albert Weber. And he designed and built the entire interior, which is no simple task, is it, Howard? Bob helped a lot, yeah. You were?
I was busy doing something.
Oh, okay. But you remember how hard it was. I remember, yeah. Isaac Decker isn't around anymore, is he? Isaac Decker isn't around anymore. No. He's from Spencer. The main goal was to manufacture a first-rate feed for cows, horses, pigs, and poultry. The horse feed manufacture dropped from a pre-war high of 2 tons a day to 2 tons per month, with post-war replacement of horses by tractors. And about this time, Wardenvinskoye began to be dealer for Ellis Chalmers Tractor, and John Yost and his brother Charles were part of that up at the upper mill.
I was probably I worked as a millwright a little bit in a smaller mill.
And you did? But you sold the Alice Chalmers tractor. Yeah.
City boy.
City boy, yeah. The D.L.N.W. Railroad closed the line through Candor in 1957. The Holmes and Relier Mill in Owego on the Erie Railroad main line was for sale, so Wardenvinskoye bought it to keep their railroad unloading facilities. This doubled their milling capacity and gave them a fine market in the Owego area. Dwayne Sheffield became manager, and Don Gowan joined the corporation in 1963. By 1960, a retail outlet was added in Berkshire. The employees numbered between 25 and 30 men. A huge bulk unloading elevator was added in 1963, and 4 cement storage silos were built on the Owego property. The storage silos were used for bulk fertilizer. Most of the feed is delivered to the farmers now in bulk truckloads and power augured into the farmers' grain bins. The 2 mills, this is 1967, manufacture about 50 tons of feed a day. Fertilizers and limes are spread on the farmer's field from the bulk trucks. The Candor mills closed and all operations are in Owego, and they had just installed a computer-operated mill there, and that's up and running as of now. And the Candor mill was used only for grinding corn, and in 1985, is that right, Dick? Don Gowan has the lumber and hardware business in part of the mill. And Dick Neighbor was the manager there. Farming has changed drastically in the last 50 years from small, diversified operations to large mechanized businesses, and the feed miller has had to adjust his methods and materials to cope with the economic changes over 135 years. It's now 30 years more, and Wardenskoye is still in operation. I have something I want to show you. This, during the 30s, 1936 this was, times were very hard. People could hardly put one foot ahead of the other. And there was an Indian woman called Minnie Kalea who owed my father, Wardenskoye, a lot of money. And she didn't have any money, but she had this piece, this white silk, of beadwork. And my father accepted it as payment for her debt. And I took it to the new museum up in Cooperstown for Indian Affairs. And he said, you can't return it to the tribe. It was hers to give. She considered it valuable. Your father accepted it as a legal payment of a debt, and therefore I should display it and be proud of it. And you made the frame for it, right? So you had a question.
No, it was just, when I moved to Candor, I was told that there were 15,000 farm families in Wardenskoye's area for the farm machines. And not many years later, we're down to 300. And the farms cleared land and stuff, and they trail around all over the world now.
Yes.
Farmers are no more.
Any other questions? Yeah?
Stand right up so you know.
Our minute pudding was usually a Sunday night supper. Well, one day Mother wasn't home. I was going to make minute pudding. So, got the water scalded, but I didn't think it was going to go like this. I dropped it in. My minute pudding was a stone in the middle of the kitchen. And my brother never let me forget it.
Just think of what the buckwheat went to in your stomach.
And then another morning, we woke up, or were awakened by my dad's shotgun going off in the air. And there had been a band of gypsies down off the hill, and they got into the buckwheat field. And they just up a little knoll from the barn, and Dad heard it. Well, he first shot the gun off in the air. The bags of buckwheat were left, and they went flying.
Don't hear gypsies anymore. And I remember my father swore also as a child, and they threatened that the gypsies would come and steal it and put it in a box if he didn't stop swearing. Yeah. There was also in my family major battle with dust. This feast of dust was on his clothes all the time. My mother was preparing for a meeting at the house and had washed all of the pillow covers in the living room. And Helen Craig was over there for lunch, and my father came home, well, it was dinner in those days, came home, and my mother said, "Now, CP, don't you dare sit on any of my pillows." Helen Craig said in her large, booming voice, "CP, you can come over to my house and sit on any pillow you want."
Well, Bayonne will be here for a while. It's a lot of things here to look at, and I'm sure that she'll be happy to describe them to you. But we have a gentleman in the back, I don't know his name, who brought some things from the upper mill, and I'd just like to make some comments about it.
I used to go to, I'm Doug Hayner. My father was Ralph Hayner, and my father was, for many years, after he retired, he was an avid photographer. He went all over. He has every building in Candor imaginable. And I was in high school at the time when the mill was going to be destroyed. And he went over and seen Dick Van Scoy and said, "Dick, I'd like to get some pictures of the interior works of the mill." And we went up inside the old mill, and all the gears and everything were all in place at that time still. And we got up in there, and in the back corner, the gables of the upper mill, in the crates were these gears. And I don't know at this, I wanted to bring them tonight because I have no idea if these were a working
No.
part of it or casting or what. If you want to see them, they're all
Pattern.
they're patterned.
Pattern.
So I wanted to try to get some insight on that, on what they were. When my father went in the nursing home, I received them. They've been on my wall for many years. And I've had a lot of enjoyment, and my children have. And I just like to donate them to the Historical Society to put in their museum down there. They're getting dried out with the wood heat and so on and so forth. But I have pictures. My father has them on slides, and when I say he was an avid photographer, we have filing cabinets full of pictures and slides. So I was unable to come up with the pictures of the inside workings, but I have all the gears that they tore out of the top and dumped up here and buried. You called the main race for the mill race and everything. That has all the wooden gears on the top of it still, if anybody would like to see them. And what intrigued me, can I set this here? I don't know how old these are, but I mean, they just perfectly interlocked. I mean, what craftsman?
There were patterns for the cast iron. They were actually wooden gears in a lot of mills.
Also, because Dick says, they're all going to be destroyed, nothing's going to be saved.
The lignum vitae we talked about would be underwater forever.
Very hard
And
wood.
it needs a tree of life.
These were cast iron. That's right, Howard.
Yeah, they would have been made out of cast iron. You can go to Enfield and see the original mill and it's wooden gears.
A lot of it is. Because I see these were all, inlaid. I mean, they really took some time.
Oh, yeah.
What they did with those, they're patterned. They would, a lot of the areas had their own foundries. And what you could do with those is put them in the sand, and they would take the pattern out, pour the thing. And that's why your big gear has shows an X in it, but that's, the whole thing is all poured at one time.
Okay.
That would be done on one side, and then you do it on the other side.
And just combine the two, what you share.
Combine the two together.
So I just thought if anybody would like to see them, and that way the whole community can get some enjoyment out of it.
Very nice.
eventually, hopefully, get displayed in our museum. And that reminds me, anything that you have in your families, if you come across things that society can use and you don't have a further use for them, please remember us. We're in the market to take anything that you have. That's good. All right, anything else? Does anyone have any comments, any questions? We do have refreshments. Please stay around, enjoy the refreshments, have a time of fellowship together. Bayonne will be here to talk with, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
That's the same here as the large pattern. It's hard to tell. I have a sense of scale.
And the kid said, we were going through the pictures, and the kids were just babies with grandpa. The kid was attracted. So, if down the road,
Thank you, Herb.
real piece of work, man.
Yes, it is.
Let me get a front-on view here.
Yeah.
No problem. Nancy's at the store all the time. What I was going to do is have you're working and a picture of the upper dome also. I'll put it on a slide. I plan on making copies and then I'm going to give them your next meeting, have Cassie, because Dad's got all the pictures of this, the upper one, all the inside workings up here. He's got all those, the Baptist church up there in Fairfield. He's got every church in
Patterns like that. I would guess so, yeah.
Well, I remember, you know, we went to kids growing up.
Most of them been burned a long time ago.
Yeah, right, yeah. You know?
We did a lot of things.
I remember that.
Turn it up, take your old place out.